Thank you very much for coming, in spite of the non-existent rain this time. The previous one we had to refer to that, and I, I hope that the somewhat personal and somewhat peculiar content of this evening's talk is not going to scare you too much, because it's not really scary. So let me say then that the book by Mitch Horowitz that we were quoting from the other time, which is called what's it called? Occult.
History of America? History of America?
No.
No.
Anyway, it's left in the office. I think it's called the. I got to get it.
I'm gonna go get it.
Able to find it.
Send you brownies.
Anyway, there's a very good. I need that book by Mitch Horowitz. I left it in the sorry. Oh, she got it. There'll be a reward for that.
She's so big.
Yeah. This is a recently published book called Modern Occultism by Mitch Horowitz, who is a long-time acquaintance of ours, and who, among other things, had invented a new term, actually adopted it from the German, which I became very fond of, and which is really, to some extent, the subject of this evening's talk, and that is the mythic figure that generally referred to by the Greek term of Demiurge, but to which he gave a German term that I consider to be extremely clever, which is what? It is the Ersatz God. Now, Ersatz is a German term that most of us who were in Europe during the war will remember, and it means a substitute. So that the Nazis like to try to pawn off on the people all kinds of things. Substitute meat, substitute vegetable, substitute sausage, whatever, that's all called Ersatz. So this is a substitute for the real God. And Mitch Horowitz came up with that, and I will always be grateful to him for that. Now then, and it is in this book, which I think is a splendid compendium of primarily historical material on the esoteric tradition. Horowitz is very knowledgeable. He's a big admirer of Manly Hall. We know him quite well. He's a member of the Theosophical Society. But he is a singularly good historian. And so, if you like to have after all, it's not even that big, you like to have a good compendium of the history of the esoteric tradition, then you can get hold of this one. It's a very good book, and among others, it contains the newly invented ancient German term of the Ersatz God. Now, that's just to give some justification for my hysterical behavior here a minute ago, where I thought that I had left modern occultism and called it somewhere else, and which has now heroically been retrieved. So and truly, I would say that if you don't find some pretty reliable information on some subject within esoterica in this book, then you're not likely to find it anywhere else. It's really good. Initially I was presented with a copy because I know the author, and I said, oh well, another Mitch Horowitz, you know, is there another spot on the piles and piles of books that I have in my apartment or not? So just fling it there. But then when I started reading it, I really acquired a great deal of respect for it. So they're very welcome to look it over, and perhaps at some point you'll get your own copy. Now, we are, in terms of the overall topic, we are really uh, repeating ourselves somewhat here, because I had already given a talk about this particular and probably a pretty much unique feature of the Gnostic tradition, which brings out the mythic esoteric figure that Mr. Horowitz called the Ersatz God. And this is the figure of Demiurge. Now, why would people like the old Gnostics have came up with that idea and made it such an important feature of their philosophy? Well, first of all, they weren't the first words as early as they could have been, because the great Plato, whom everyone clear into the Middle Ages regarded and referred to as the divine Plato, the great Plato is probably the first person who mentions the name and the concept of Demiurge. And what Plato did not make any judgments, but he just said that the high gods of the ancient Greeks themselves would not, I just use that term, would not lower themselves to create a world like ours, that they were too smart for that and too aesthetically savvy, but that therefore that he introduced the concept that between the great gods, the ultimate gods, and our own peculiar world, there was another agency. And this other agency he called the Demiurge, which really means the half-maker. And so what is implied in that Platonic statement is that about half of our reality is not real. Half of our reality is fabricated by an entity that is not the true creator. Now, it would seem, according to the testimony of various scriptures, that the old Gnostics were very partial to this Platonic concept and elaborated on it and worked it in their own way into their vast creation mythology. And we mentioned all of that before. So what is really what this really implies is that as it is stated at considerable length, especially in the Gnostic book Pistis Sophia, which was only discovered in the very end of the 19th century, when I forget that, I just remind myself that Madame Blavatsky was still alive and she still commented on it when it was discovered, so obviously it was not in the 20th century. So in any event, there we have a very complete and very beautiful myth of Gnostic provenance, which tells us in mythological and poetic terms about the coming and the nature and the function of this demiurgic figure. And so that is also an important thing to remember. So what it really amounts to is that, of course, as Professor Quispel, the great expert on Gnosticism from Holland, he's no longer with us either. He was Carl Jung's closest advisor in matters Gnostic. Very, very wonderful gentleman. We had him here. In fact, he spoke for us, and the folks from BRS had just left, but he spoke for us at the full house at BRS, and he also spoke by our invitation, or partial invitation, at the Jung Society now. People, great and wonderful gentleman, and he indicated that the myth of the demiurge, or for that matter, the majority of the Gnostic myths which permeate such books like the Pistis Sophia, and which are present at least in somewhat smaller form in the various other Gnostic Gospels, that their origin was in the expression of the insightful qualities and the visionary powers of various Gnostic teachers. And that therefore, the way the process works, first there is the Gnostic vision, and then the Gnostic vision, in order to communicate it to others, is turned into a myth. So experience, first-hand experience, usually or at least in part of a visionary character, and the various great motifs in ancient Gnostic lore are owing to the fact that these people were really what they said they were. They were toi Gnostic, or as the Greek word has it, in the plural, they were knowers. These are the people who knew. And when they knew something, then they wanted to communicate it to others, which is a common endeavor of many of us, not always successful, but nevertheless there. So first is the experience, and then the experience is turned into, I think, a complete term for it would be mythopoetic form. It's like poetry, and it's like a myth. And in that fashion, it is easier to pass on and to hopefully generate similar, if not identical, experiences in other people, which is, after all, the subject of many good books, that we read them, we are inspired thereby, and then maybe something of a kindred nature will come forth in our own experience, and that will be really enjoyable, probably more enjoyable than somebody else had the experience. Because somehow our own experience, put it in vulgar terms, our own stuff is somehow always more interesting than somebody else's. That's just the way it always has been, and that's the way it still is. Now, that being the case, then, let us say the Platonic, or at least originally Platonic idea of a fabricator, of a maker, who is not really a creator, but rather a maker who makes things on the basis of various experiences, various insights, various teachings that he may have partaken of, but who therefore, when all is said and done, creates a creation considerably inferior to the one that is created by, people use the term, high gods. And that indeed the Gnostics said that there was such a being, and that this being had a great deal to do with the fabricating of our world, the one within which we live, and that this is an important cosmo-historical event. Now, what we are dealing with here, to just throw in a little more meat, since I'm not a vegetarian, throw in a little more spice into the situation. Let's just say that the essence of the message of the myth of the Demiurge, as it is portrayed in Pistis Sophia and alluded to in other scriptures, has to do with the myth of Sophia. Sophia, the wisdom, who is really, if you wanted to use that term, I don't think she would mind. She's very God-minded, she would, in any event, I don't think she would mind being indicating, is one of the high, transcendental, really important powers in the Gnostic pantheon. And I'll just very quickly sort of recount that much, that ever since my childhood, when I first came across Gnosticism, I always had this notion, but it is just obviously a mental notion whereby one tries to account for data that come to one's attention, that somehow Sophia, the great creative wisdom woman, the great aeon of the high heavens, got into a predicament. She wasn't in her own place anymore, she was sort of displaced. It was all kind of unhappy situation. And within that unhappy situation, in part perhaps as the result of her unhappiness, she has brought into manifestation a being, and this being is the Demiurge. The name by which he is most frequently alluded to in various Gnostic scriptures is what is often called a barbarous word, and a barbarous word is a word that doesn't mean anything in any known language. I was once present at a school here, not very far away, at a reception for the lady who at that time was the Queen of Greece, Queen Frederica of Greece, and she was a German by birth. And so, there's only one thing I remember of Her Majesty's speech, and that was telling the people, look, I too was born as a barbarian, because she was a German. Anybody who is not a Greek is a barbarian. And why is that? Because the Greeks said the only language worth speaking, of course, is Greek. What else? But they also said that that being the case, the languages of other people, when they speak with the Greeks, sounds like bar, 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 bar. In other words, it's a barbarous tone. And the people who don't speak Greek or other languages, they are barbarians. because of the barbarous languages that they speak. So I'm sure that you are tremendously excited
Yes.
by that information.
Can you speak Greek?
Well, I had, how much? I had about 3 years of it in school and ancient
Could
Greek.
you say something now?
Later. Oh yeah, yes. So let us say then that that being the case, the name that is mentioned for the Demiurge, the half-maker, is of that nature. It is a barbarous name. It is one that doesn't mean anything in Greek or in Latin or in any other language. And it is called Yaldabaoth. And there is no way of figuring out a rational reason for it, but the ending vowels is often attached to hybrid names, and the yald in turn may or may not have some connection with the Yod He Vav He name of the Old Testament. But because certainly there is a convergence, and the more you know about the Gnostic, this Gnostic deity figure, or know more about the Hebrew God, then you can see that there is a considerable and somewhat disquieting relationship. Yeah, maybe more, a little bit more about that later. But so Yald and the ending vowels is one that is sometimes attached to the ancient words at that time. Now this Yaldabaoth is himself brought forth into manifestation by Sophia. So he has some of Sophia's wisdom, Sophia's substance in him. He is not he's not any kind of a dumbbell, but let us say he is he's good. He's been settled with too big a job. In other words, by creating this world, he took on a task that maybe was a little bit beyond him, and that therefore often didn't end up all that well, which happens when a workman of inferior knowledge undertakes some kind of creative work. For, for, for creative work, more than anything else, you need one thing, and I think that you get creativity. You don't have that, you can have all kinds of book knowledge, you can have all kinds of interactions with other people, you can have what the present world is so fond of, a lot of data, but you probably still don't have anything very outstanding. Now then, let me jump a few centuries up to the Romantic era in England, where the great poet, who at the same time also was certainly by disposition, by the inclination of his own nature, very much of a Gnostic, William Blake, and I am not going to read to you any kind of lengthy Blakean literature, but something that speaks to our point, I think. And many of you have seen this because it's one of the more popular romantic pieces of Blake. And it's the poem that I think officially is called, that Blake called Sick Rose. Alright. O Rose, thou art sick. The invisible world that flies in the night, in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love Does thy life destroy? Now, what do we have here? We have the indication that something that on its own would be and deserves to be truly beautiful and admired and incorporated into one's poetry and so forth has a sickness, so to die. I would say the rose is somewhat a metaphor for the world. The world, well, depending on where you are, if you are on Beachwood Drive, this part of the world, you can probably still use this. The world is pretty nice looking. But then when you move around in the world and have various experiences and so forth, you find out that maybe it's not all that it is touted about. You may find out that in spite of its virtues, in spite of its beauty, and its frequently revelatory disclosures, the world is sick, and that this judgment, you might say, can be applied to almost anything, almost anybody, that there is a flaw in everything. Maybe larger flaw, maybe smaller flaw. Maybe the flaw won't bother you. Maybe the flaw even attracts you. It has happened. All of these things can happen. But we live amidst flawed experiences in a flawed world. And you better become aware of that, because if we are not, then we are going to be sadly disappointed and we'll have very unpleasant experiences. On the other hand, if this is somehow part of the picture of our reality, then we will deal with life on a more realistic basis, and that will be to our benefit. Now, that being the case, we may ask ourselves, especially if we are one of those hardy folks who love to call themselves, and sometimes each other, but more just themselves, Bible Christians. You know? I always thought that when you are that involved in the Bible, then maybe you have lived once in the Tower in any event. And probably I've always been convinced that the English slang word to babble maybe is founded, maybe has a biblical foundation, because there everybody in the story, everybody is talking to everybody, but nobody understands anybody. And so they are babbling. They are talking like the people really babble. But maybe that's enough of that play with words. But let's say it is fairly obvious that we live in a world where, let us say, the presumption of perfection, or even anything resembling perfection, is bound to be misplaced, because we live in a fallen world. This does not mean that we should not avail ourselves of such experiences and such things as may come our way that may appeal to us in this world. Of course we should. But it also needs to tell us that likelihood is that somewhere along the line you are going to discover that there is something with where you are, with who you are with, and with what you are doing. Now this is a very sad judgment, but I feel that if we do not come to some extent to an intelligent and emphasize intelligent and balanced apprehension of that circumstance, then we are going to have a very unhappy life. While on the other hand, if we come to recognize the flawed nature of various experiences and of various things and people that life may bring us, then we will be better off. So I would think that to some extent and degree, this strange circumstance has arisen in the minds of most of us and of most people in the past. After all, here we are, let's say, in the lands of the Bible, today's Christianity. You could even include Islam, because the Prophet Muhammad learned a great deal from Hebrew law. I don't think his followers now recognize that very much, but he certainly did. In any event, let us say, we may come to the conclusion that yes, there is a world in not only every breaking hose, but there is a world in every apple. And if there isn't one, then maybe the apple is just not ripe enough. Maybe it isn't complete enough. When I was a youngster, I lived in a place where we had a lot of apple trees, and I know it was a matter of my frequent recognition. Oh, there it is, there's another baby. Big fat world. Big fat world. However, they fairly
Protein.
yeah, and they move slowly, and they don't really menace you much. A rattlesnake is much more dangerous. So now, in any event, let's see, when these issues are faced, then there comes, of course, the other big question. If indeed this world was created as described in the first book of Genesis, and in the various expositions and commentaries that accede to that, then why in the heck have we got so much trouble in this world? If this was created by a good God who desires our good, and who, in other words, who is benevolent toward us, then how come we miss that benevolence so grievously in so many experiences of our lives? Now, of course, I'm not here to confess to you, but let's say I'm sure that you will share with me some of these recognitions, that maybe not so very often, maybe only once or twice in life, you find yourself in a situation where you think that things are really going well. You know? And I'm not going to go into details, but sort of so many things, maybe everything, that you sort of desired, that you were longing for, that you wished that had been in association with you, is all of a sudden there. And you say to yourself, well, by come, maybe, after all, I'm going to be happy. And pretty soon after you say that to yourself, or even more disastrously to others, something happens and it's gone. And you see, you know what? I think I'm not going to get that happy after. I can think to a number of major events, some of which I carried like a great big monkey on my back for a very, very long time. That's how it is in this life. But we know if we have our eyes when he is open, we know that that's how it is in this life, but we don't know why. Why? And certainly one of the partly mythological, partly philosophical ways of accounting for such circumstances is just what we were hinting at and what the Gnostics were talking about, that the making, the fabrication, the bringing into existence, the creation of this, I won't even just say world, but of this reality, must have been in hands, must have come from a consciousness that fell very much short of the deific attributes and the attributes of wisdom and goodness that we find in so many of the religious scriptures, including the Old Testament. I well remember an answer that was given to me by one of my teachers in school, in a Cistercian order, where I asked this particular teacher, we were alone, I wasn't going to voice such things too openly, but I said, Professor, I really think that so much that is in the Bible is just disturbing and off-putting, and really puts the higher power, which is not the term we used at that time, into a very bad position. He says, son, read the New Testament. At least there is somebody there who is completely good, and that's our Lord Christ. The rest of it, just put it aside. You don't have to read. And this man was a monk. I said to myself, well, no, this kind of teacher I like. In any event, so obviously we have a situation here where the two concepts or images of the Creator on the one hand and the maker of virtue and goodness, virtus, Latin, really means strength. And I'm not going to tell you the rest of the Latin implications because you are going to denounce me to the feminists. And to fall into the claws of the feminists is a dreadful fate. So, and you know why? Because virtus, the first syllable in virtus is vir, which is man, like virility and things of that sort. And the way the virtue came about is manly virtue. The way my Latin teacher used to say, well, don't get you boys because we are all boys, and don't think therefore that just because you are male, you are virtuous. But the Romans apparently thought so. Because virtus. So in any event, we need to keep in mind that these qualities, when discerned in the world, are few in number and open to all kinds of often difficult questions. So that being the case, then we can move on a little better. And once we come to the conclusion that, for instance, one of the greatest scholars and propagators of mythology, the late Joseph Campbell, had often mentioned that the Bible is a myth. And if you understand it in mythological terms, then you will understand it better and you will profit from your biblical studies. But if you don't, then that is not very likely to happen. So I don't really know why I brought that up, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. Well, let us say now what we have therefore is that there are some very potentious, very heavy uh, circumstances, data, whatever you want to call it, in earthly life, which cannot be accounted for very well by an ethically and in other ways perfect creator and guardian of the world. If the world really had such a power that brought it into existence, it would partake of a much, much higher degree of perfection than anything else. So this being the case then, it is a rather understandable notion that one begins to think that maybe some other power, maybe some other consciousness, some other kind of creator, maybe an Ersatz God, as you would say in Nazi Germany, where everything was a substitute, maybe an Ersatz God somehow got into the act and followed up the situation. And through a gigantic divine creative monkey wrench into creation, maybe something of that sort can happen. And that is, let's say, at least the mythic explanation for the Gnostic Demiurge. Now, this being the case, we then may move on from there, and if we have a considerable amount of self-reflection, which is a good thing to have, we might think, well, if that is the case, if the creating agency of this world within which I live, both all the physical, the emotional, the mental, all of these worlds, all of them put together, is rather imperfect, himself or herself or itself, then what can I do about it? And the immediate answer that offers itself, although it is not totally satisfactory, is that you need to somehow work and live in this imperfection, accept its existence, but at the same time also accept its the difficulties that you are going to encounter, and to hope perhaps for some modality, for some way whereby you could at least partially extricate yourself from such an imperfect world. Because the principle is the same. Let's say you are taking a trip and you are getting a hotel room and you put your suitcases down and you really don't like this. So what are you going to do? Either find a new room, which that is where our metaphor breaks down. Or you just accept it the way it is and somehow wiggle through the situation, and next morning you leave your money at the counter in the garage. So let's say to feel yourself somewhat in a predicament, and in not being wise and smart and powerful enough to really, really soberly do something about it, I would say that is a natural human difficulty. Once again, our friends, the Romans and the Greeks, who had a proverb for everything. My father was was a student with the Jesuits, and he knew innumerable Latin proverbs. Anything that happened, or should have happened, or could have happened, he had a Latin proverb for it. I'm not going to recount any of them. But let us say, if indeed we have within us a superior consciousness, a consciousness that can work its way through difficulties and that probably make something good out of it, then we will recognize that to apply our consciousness to where we are is very important. And as a late friend of mine used to say, living in this world is not a life, it is something else, it is a predicament. So all of this, I think, falls in line with what we are talking about. Now, at the same time, let us say, are there deeper, are there metaphysical and transcendental aspects of this situation? And I think that it is fairly easy to recognize that there are. I am reminded of a statement made by a late and great scholar of Gnosticism, and it was to the effect that our condition is not due primarily to external causes, material or even psychological, but that an existential situation that goes much deeper than any of them. Summarizing the simple symptoms of this existential condition, this particular late great scholar of Gnosticism, I'm speaking of Hans Jonas, whose book published way back in the 30s, I think, if not the 20s, is still one of the best short compendia of Gnostic teaching. He said that these are our existential situation as human beings in this world consists of forlornness, dread, homesickness, numbness, sleep, intoxication, forgetfulness. And last but certainly not least, being spiritually defeated by the noise of the world. Yeah? Hans Jonas was a really smart person. So this latter condition is well expressed either in a statement of the mildly inimical, but always suspect demiurgic presence. That there is a creative and recreative force, a kind of consciousness in this world that brings about these kinds of conditions in our own life and in our own situation. So let's say that being the case, so far, let's say, of our diagnosis, people other than Gnostics have recognized this diagnosis, and Hans Jonas himself was quite involved with the existentialist intellectuals at that time, and he recognized this diagnosis which he inherited from Kierkegaard in the existentialists, namely Kierkegaard called it the sickness unto death. Now, I always felt when existentialism was a big thing when I was going to university. I came to think of it a little bit less important in terms later on, but still. So let's say this is maybe a little bit too harsh a judgment, but nevertheless it has much truth. So let's say so far the diagnosis of our condition. People other than Gnostics have recognized this diagnosis, just like Kierkegaard, of the sickness unto death, while they also voiced the consciousness of forlornness and dread and alienation. Unlike the existentialists, however, and this is important for us to remember, because otherwise, for one thing, you're not going to come back here anymore. You won't want to listen to this old pessimist guy here. So, unlike the existentialists, the Gnostics, on the other hand, suggested a remedy. And what is that remedy? Well, it could be called various things. Since I am going to be talking very soon about something to begin that general field, right now I would call it the magic of gnosis. And one can know something, and by way of this process of knowing, one can break through the obstacles and overcome the conditions of forlornness, of dread, of homesickness, of numbness, of sleep, of intoxication and forgetfulness. I think so one of the scholars there also, if I can remember correctly, also inserted that we, and George here for one has certainly picked up on that we are like sleepwalkers. We are here and we are yet not completely here. And that all of this has to do with the weird kind of world into which we came. But at the same time, the Greeks, who after all knew everything, or almost everything, and whose intellectual and spiritual children we are, the Greeks had on one of the Greek islands that was called the Isle of Magnes, Magnes, and it's from the name of that island that all kinds of terms right now where the people have this mispronounced political soul of MAGA. It's not MAGA, it's MEGA. But then who am I to teach Greek to the dumbbells in the world? But let us say, from the name of that island came the entire, let's say, mythos of greatness and of magnification. Because one of the conditions that we found maybe still on the island of Magnes was that there were a lot of magnets, rolled stones, and that when one came up with some iron, small quantities, larger quantities, these rolled stones would draw the metal to themselves, and thereby what would happen? They would get bigger. And that is a process of increase, or we have a word for it also, magnification. And now then, how does this have anything to do with Demiurge and Gnostics and things of this sort? Well, it has something to do because the Greeks used this condition on the Isle of Magnus as a living metaphor for increase. And when it came to the increase of consciousness, the increase of the mind, the increase of vision, the increase of our gnosis, then they said that it is magnified. And another important word came into being at the same time. And you know what that is? Magic. Magia. Because it's the same root from which magnification of the magnet and the Isle of Magnus come from. Why is that? Because a good definition, to begin with, of magic is that it, by way of it, we can increase our soul, our spirit, our consciousness. Yeah. We can do that. It takes that. You're not going to increase it very much with anything else. You're certainly not going to increase it with most academic scholarship, because it is dry and ultimately useless for spiritual purposes, and many other disciplines that we encounter. But the ancients said, yes, that is all true, but you can also do things that are going to increase your consciousness, where you will include now in your circle, in your magic circle, which is after all a part of the situation also. Included in your magic circle, there will be more and more important and interesting and transformative and insight-producing material. You can do that. You can be more than what you are. And of course they say, oh well, gnosis, that means knowledge. Yes, but it's not the ordinary kind of knowledge. And so the Greeks then came to apply to this kind of knowledge. There is a kind of knowledge that will take you into a deep understanding, a deep knowledge of things. And when you have that, then your being, your pneuma, which is your spirit, increases, and you are gradually perhaps, but withdrawing your presence from that unpleasant atmosphere within which you live, and which brings all the difficult things that we mentioned before, until you end up in George Gurdjieff's words as a sleepwalker. Your consciousness, most of your consciousness having gone to sleep, and you being just sort of toddling along in this world in an unsatisfactory fashion. So now we come to the fact that quite early, at least in our history of the Mediterranean culture, which is after all where we come from, and as Harold Bloom, the great philosopher, has said, when it comes to our minds, when it comes to our consciousness, we are all children of the Greeks. And that is true, because they started thinking about and working with things pretty much before anybody did. And the ancient world pretty much recognized that. Everybody, even the Egyptians, had a great deal of respect for the Greeks. Of course, the Greeks in turn also have a respect for the Egyptians. And they said that, the Greeks said that all the Greek policies were in reality aspects of Isis. So they really respected the Egyptian gods. They knew that the Egyptians had some kind of strange connection over there. They had some kind of strange gnosis that came down to them for over thousands of years and that could still be adapted to contemporary circumstances. But let us say that is what needs to be remembered, that there is a magic, and that is the magic of gnosis, whereby consciousness can be increased, and by way of that increased consciousness, we can handle this peculiar, strange, and often crazy-making world with some degree of ease. Because if you live in a crazy place and you don't do something about your life and about your consciousness, then you will be crazy too. Maybe it doesn't take a great deal of wisdom to discern that, but we have to be able to counteract the strange and crazy making, which is a legitimate word, crazy making qualities of earthly life. And once again, jumping back, since we always like to see the beginning, all right, we may say that, so then does that mean that since obviously creativity is present, obviously many things and many beings have been created somehow. But could it be possible that a consciousness that is not particularly wise or benign was involved in that creative process, and that this needs to be taken into consideration? And that is how the concept of the Demiurge, the one who is smart enough to make part of reality. But then what do you do? Well, I would suggest that what you do then you turn into a creator yourself. And you can make the other half of reality. And that making of the other half of reality, as the Greeks should have said, that is magia, that is magic. And that is why magic to us now, even in a place like the Magic Castle up here in Hollywood and so forth, always appears as doing something contrary to the existing reality. Doing strange magic tricks, because only by strange magic tricks can we somehow deflate the lack of magic, the illogical, the oppressive and consciousness destroying qualities of the reality of the world in which we live. We have a defense, but ultimately that defense is deeply, deeply hidden, deeply concealed within us. Yet it is there. And if we call upon it, then we can at least try to collaborate, if collaboration is needed, with forces, with individuals, with forms of consciousness who are able to keep the false creator, the Ersatz God, at bay, and who can bring in a vision, an understanding, a conception of reality that is superior to that. Now that being sort of the general intro to this, maybe we can paint a little bit of a picture that will make it more graphically apparent to us as to what the Gnostic is trying to do. The Gnostic is trying to overcome the imperfect, to say the least, imperfect reality within which he or she lives, and to develop a faculty within himself or herself whereby reality can really be changed. So we may say, okay, go along with the first book of Genesis, but there maybe I live in a world of a creator, but I can be the recreator. And that recreation, that new creation, can occur in my consciousness. Because somehow, mysteriously and yet miraculously and wonderfully, that creative spark, that ultimate spark of creativity, that flame of the eternal has been placed into me, and therefore I can stand up to all kinds of demiurges, to all kinds of false deities. I have something within me, even though small, even though less potent at this particular time, but I have something in me that is not only equal to, but that is superior to all the demiurges. Why? St. Paul the Apostle said very simply, because in you, the Christ in you, the hope of glory. In other words, the anointed, the one who descended from on high, the ultimate messenger, is not just out there. No, right here. If you know how to call on that presence, if you have a good relationship, then you are able to draw yourself away from this, let's say, this demiurgic unreality. Now, time always moves along with us so fast, but let us say, what we need to keep in mind is that we are all, and we have a particular reason for phrasing it this way, we are all magi, magicians. We have within us the power to form and to transform. And with the power to transform, we can transform the false, the deceptive, and the ultimately terrible reality into which we are placed. We can do that. And in so doing, we can alter the demiurgic reality within which we find ourselves. That being the case, I will indicate to you well, before I indicate that, maybe I need to say more. One of the proofs, we might say, one of the realities that jump out after us in this world of the false creation of the false God of the Ersatz God is the fact that there are many unsavory and not so unsavory, but a whole gamut of forms of consciousness that have come down into this external manifestation and that we have to deal with. And to You only can deal with it from a superior position. And that superior position must be the ongoing discovery of our own indwelling, what the magicians call Holy Guardian Angel, the HGA, of our own indwelling ultimate essence. The closer we come to that, the easier we can cope with all of these situations that arise. Now, you might say then, is this this Demiurge, is this being a demon? No. He has created a few demons, but he is one. And so let us say we are not dealing really with a superior entity that is evil, but we created one that in its creativity is somewhat inept. He's done things, I almost said he's done things, God bless him, and he's done things, but he didn't do them that well. And many of them he hasn't done so well. And he says, how can you say that of the creator of the universe? How? By observing what's going on, they can say it. But on the other hand, you also have to remember that the ability, the power to bring about a creative change, bringing the various elements of spirit out into the open, and of beginning to utilize them for your own gnosis, for your own enlightenment, is something that we can do. Because somehow there are a few things that were not taken into hand by the Ersatz God. And one of them is what? One of them is perhaps the mosquito, because nobody can control the mosquito. So probably the Ersatz God could not control the mosquito either. But no, in other words, the ability to by and by, which is the old expression, by and by obtain a mastery over this situation. But by and by be able to reduce the number of oppressive creations of the Demiurge, to reduce these to a smaller number, and thereby become free ourselves. This is present and this is given. Now, for instance, it is to be understood that the majority of at least one, I didn't that a very large number of beings, both physical and non-physical, in this world, are the creations of the Demiurge. But not all. That there are others that are quiet, that are good, and that can be helpful to us in our acquisition of greater consciousness. And so we have to know. We have to have the kind of gnosis whereby we distinguish that which has a transformative and insight-producing potential from the one that does not. And as I mentioned before, and I'm going to make a big jump, it will be difficult to follow, but that's almost all. Let us say, as I mentioned before, at least some of the recovery of our original consciousness and our defeat of the works of the Demiurge must come about by way of magic. And that there are various forms of that, and I'm going to speak of one now, and heaven help me, I may even read to you a poem that of all people I wrote years ago as the result of a magical experience. So if at all possible, don't hold it against me. In any event, the various ultimately transformational magical practices always have their humble beginnings, wherein the magus, the magician, begins to develop the power, develop the ability to call forth beings, existences, forces that ordinarily are not real. Now, back in the 19th century, and you all have probably at one time had some real glimpse of it, there came into existence an assembly of, for the most part, really rather outstanding people, that among them there were many, many theosophists. And this assembly, which started in England, was called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And now, in the Golden Dawn practice, among other things, you teach people how to develop the magical powers whereby they can bring forth and have converse with realities, with entities, with beings that one ordinarily does not encounter. And so when, just very quickly, when somebody was initiated into the first grade of Golden Dawn, then usually this person was taught to practice two activities which would develop, that they call it, his or her magical potential. And what were these? Number one, divination. Number two, evocation and invocation. Now, what do these consist of? The issue being that in divination, the ordinarily invisible and intangible entities, at least that's the mythos behind it, are called into activity by way of some divinatory device. As some of you know, I am very partial to Tarot in that respect, but there are many others. This engaging in divinatory practice and in the proper manner, and not making gypsy fortune telling out of it, but be able to combine the deeper, the transformative, the spiritual aspect of the situation into the operation, is a great way of developing a certain magical potential within the individual. Because it's not called divination for nothing. It is called divination because it acknowledges, among other things, you can have other interpretations, but it acknowledges a divinity, something that is really from the high divinity as resident within the soul. And that when our human personality can so be constrained and can step aside with his more holy pursuits, then the guidance and the insight and the foretelling even of what to expect is more likely to come forth from the psyche. So the divination, therefore, is a very valuable exercise in the development, the training, and the gradual coming into its own of the indwelling divine power, which in the magical tradition is often referred to as the Holy Guardian Angel. Well, I say that that's a purely historical reasons, because while there were a heck of a lot of magicians and diviners in, let's say, medieval times, uh, they couldn't be too open about it. The unholy Inquisition was around at many times, and if they found you to be engaged in heretical practices, your fate might have been quickly predicted in a very unsavory fashion. And so you have to be careful with this. And so what, let's say, the mythos was really developed that by the divinatory device, whether it's a tarot card or whether it is any number of divining devices, by these which in Roman times would be called the divi, the gods, the transcendental powers can be activated. And if the situation is appropriate, they can help you out, they can do something for you. And some of the first important practitioners of divination, by the way, in the Mediterranean area, you would expect the Egyptians or somewhere too, were what seemed to be the ancient inhabitants of the Italian peninsula, who were known as the Etruscans. Now the Etruscans were a bunch of diviners and magicians and witches of major proportions. And it was from the Etruscans, really, that the Romans and even some of the Greeks learned their divinatory practice. So let us say that is sort of the first big step, because now you address the various entities, the divinities, and by way of that contact, you may increase, so to say, your consciousness. The second step in the Golden Dawn program, are we getting pretty late? Yeah?
No.
No?
Very
No,
interesting.
yes.
This is in the second step.
Oh, no, yeah, we can go for it. Just for it. So, let's say, in order to stimulate that interior creativity, the Magi of the Golden Dawn invented or brought into prominence also the second instrumentality, which they called a which is called evocation and invocation. By the easier one, and that deals with a more primitive kind of consciousness, is the one called evocation. And evocation addresses itself to a primitive kind of spirits, who have been called the submundanes, because they live in the dark. They are not demons, but they are entities of a strange and ancient nature that live out of sight. And just because they are not so terribly bright and very active, they will listen to a magician more easily, and when they are called forth in their accustomed manner, the manner that they are accustomed to, and they will maybe come forth and discourse. But by engaging in that type of activity, the Golden Dawn magicians would receive a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of training, how to deal with the ordinarily invisible world. Now, needless to say, you can tell that I know a little bit more about this than I confess, and let's say I am a Golden Dawn initiate, and I know something about this thing. And when I had my first experience of evocation, I was so, I don't know what I should say, inspired or shaken up, that I sat down and I wrote a poem. And now, to your possible pleasure or displeasure, I'm going to read that poem to you. It is only 4 stanzas, and it is called Evocation. Arise from Tartarus in the dread hour of crownless snake and sepulchral fell. From a world long dead, from the mouth of hell, with wand upraised and with chanted spell, I call thee from mist unto shape and form, in a circle encompassed by fury and storm, with dagger of banishment made to dissolve the pain of the eons that ever evolve. And it was really had to be dramatic. And I had some people around me who were just really like that now. Why dost thou tarry? From years beyond count, from ages unnumbered, from time's silent fount, come now swiftly through the spectral spheres. Thou who abidest through countless years, who risest forever out of the tomb, born time and again from magical doom. Behold, thy sigil I hold upon high, conjuring thee by all Adonai. I greet thee, not now he arrives, spirit alive. I greet thee, visitor most noble and kind. With power and spell I swiftly must bind the ghost of the ages, the spirit of years, to keep the presence of him who appears. Now I approach thee, O strangest of guests, to behold my desires and hear my requests, to fulfill my wish, to reach my true goal. Grant me the boon, redeeming my soul. These are some of these are actually technical terms. The boon is really something that sometimes has to be explained. And the last stanza, the sadness of time, the tears of typhoon, the pain of Tartarus mixed with my own, wasteland and desert and flowering bloom, loveliness buried in dark depth of tomb, the gods sail away in raw solar boat, the sistrum echoes its tremulous note, grey-bearded spirit brings with pentacle bound, leaves for his realm in darkness profound. So, it will not put me into the company of the great 21st century and 20th century poets, but I think it gives you a real idea, what this was all about. This was incidentally written on June 6, 1981. with apologies to various other magical boys. You know. Yeah, it's and now then just very quickly what these rather primitive entities from the Tartarian realm, who are these? What we need to remember that the Demiurge apparently creates or helps to bring into existence various hierarchies of beings, but none of the ones that he brings into existence, unlike the human, for instance, are all that were made. He's not a very good craftsman, they will call. And so one of these is the submundanes, which are really something like ancient elementals who have been here for ages and number, maybe even before Demiurge came into existence. But on the other hand, when they are in a good mood and when they are politely addressed, they can be helpful to you. And by their mere appearance and the mere interaction with them, they can increase the awareness of your consciousness. And then the real magic takes place. Real magic will appear. Now, I must also admit that there are, of course, in the world of the demiurge is, I would say, this is a very, very highfalutin statement, but it's mainly composed of two divisions. And one of these is still the life of Sophia. It comes maybe through the demiurge, but still having the power of Sophia. Others are the ones that the demiurge or the lesser deity has sort of fabricated on their own, and these are less perfect. So what we have, we have a very ancient spirits, and it is one of those, that if you're interested in those things, then I am not even recommending them. But let us say the golden dawn mainly employed in this regard was the recipe of Solomon, which is early medieval grimoire, in which this particular type of entity is addressed and can be called for. They are by no means demons. Demons are something else. And I would say that there are entities, just exactly how they made it into this reality, and certainly in some way connected with the demiurge creation, was really, really bad. And let's say those are the ones that you don't want to have anything to do with, because let's say they don't know how to give, they only know how to take, and they can be extremely nasty and extremely unpleasant. One of our theosophical seeresses, the late Dora Kunz of blessed memory, was a very wise woman. I had a long conversation with her once up in the Hudson Valley in the state of New York, and we were talking about evil. And he said, well, we have to recognize there is evil. If we deny evil, we are denying something that is very important. But don't talk about it too much. Don't write about it too much. That's sort of thought came to me. Do you mean that if we mention it, then they perk up and say, oh, you called, I'm here? Well, she said, yeah, something like that. Just leave them all. Leave them. Realize that they are there, and sometimes you may have to realize some particular activity that may be involved, but on the whole, these are definitely not demons. In fact, I had the impression a few evocations that I did. These are called evocations, while the calling of an angelic spirit is called the invocation. So there's invocation and evocation. Calling down and calling up. But that is. But what I noticed in a few instances when I did this sort of thing, and most of the time I was a magus, which means the one who does the evoking. I think one time I was working, some of the disciplines is called a receiver, which means that the entities may come to him and try to get some message to him by way of in any event, that needs to be kept in mind. My impression of whatever comes in these evocation varieties, that they are tired, that they are sleepy, that they are a little bit at the beginning of the operation, a little bit put out that you call them off. Why did you leave us asleep? And that kind of thing. I never heard those words, but they are there. Then as you are conversing with them, they kind of wake up a little, then you can have a conversation with them, and they can convey information that otherwise might not be available to you. But let us say I've never heard or seen anything of world-shaking importance come forth from things like that. But the very action that an ordinary human like ourselves can do this sort of thing and can actually activate this sleepy old ghost is, I think, interesting because it indicates it is another proof of what Geoffrey Hodgson at another level called the brotherhood of angels and of men. We, and as Jesus Christ says in one of the Gnostic scriptures in the Gospel, that know ye, talking to his disciples, so human beings, Jewish boys, know ye not that ye are all angels, all archangels, and all the great invisible. In other words, we can interact with spirits if we wish, and you may not wish. We can interact with spirits, but the important issue is that in so doing, we have to observe certain rules, and we have to offer what we are doing to good and useful ends. And in all the good magic books, it's always there that you should conduct the magic for the benefit of people, for healing, for the increase of consciousness, things of that sort, and then you're going to be all right. Because various methods, all the great religious traditions have healing activities. I cannot think of one like that. So I thought that might be of some interest to you, and thus, let's see, it's more a lack of manual dexterity than anything that disturbs me. But let's say Demiurge, with Sophia's power, brought into manifestation all sorts of creatures, and a great many of them are not in any physical form at all. For instance, there are probably two big categories of what has been called the preternatural, which would consist of nature spirits, souls of the dead, and supernatural, which would be the deific, would be gods and goddesses and angels, messengers from the deific world. So these things are all subject to magic, and certainly the sacraments of the church, which we practice and which some of the sacramental churches, Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic practice, is a sacred magic whereby humans can have contact with the deeper world, primarily the angelic, and beyond the angelic, the transcendental. So what we need to keep in mind, therefore, and I'll conclude with one thought that I concluded before, that if indeed, and of this I am convinced by experience, I was very friendly, if he doesn't mind me saying so, wherever he is now, with Dr. Israel Regardi, who has been here in this place many times, who helps us set up a golden dogma and everything. One sterling gentleman, really like that old guy. Now, do I like this old guy? That's another question. Yeah, but maybe, but in anyways, we were all aware of this. And what he said to us, Francis was his secular name, and Israel was his chosen. He was from a New York Jewish family, and then God, maybe, but then he wrote very eloquently about Christian. In any event, Dr. Regardi also used to say that if you ultimately the great work that we are here to do is a work of magic. Yes, there was a time when it was primarily named alchemy, and the alchemy being the interaction of the two creative forces, which when they manage to interact in the right fashion, can produce very great magical results, like stone of the philosophy. But also, part of it is also ceremonial magic, and the ultimate of which Dr. Rivaldi used to say is don't be put off by the name, is the invocation, first a vision, the vision, the conversation with, and the union with the Holy Guardian Angel. And what is the Holy Guardian Angel? The Holy Guardian Angel in this case is a cryptonym, a disguised word for our own indwelling transcendental self. And the Atman of the Hindus, the Buddha nature of the Buddhists, we can give them various names, but there is something inside of us that waits to be brought into activity by way of our magic. And if we recognize his presence, I would say, and this was also regarded in the ISSB, we teach these, he did, we teach these various magical disciplines. He says, but you know, says the individual discipline matters less than the important thing about the magic is the magician. If the magician is ready, if the magician is doing what he ought to, then it will properly work. And in so doing, it has to do with the magia, with the enlarging of our soul, the enlarging of our consciousness. So that is always something that has to be taken on. And so now I mentioned at the last lecture about the Demiurge, and I hope that we are not Demiurge out. I mentioned that there have been voices, figuratively speaking, it more or less, not so terribly long ago, in the last century, in this, who seem to be indicating that not only can these various entities be magically handled, but that the time is coming when the wisdom of Sophia with human help may make such a powerful return into the world that it may re-sanctify and deify the Demiurge himself. That there is a possibility that the Demiurge will be converted. Now, it's not going to happen on television, and it's not going to happen by way of the Sunday evening preachers, I don't think, but it will happen on the part of other great transcendental and angelic beings. And this is extremely important also. And so the reaching out into these strange realms, with sacrament, with magic, with all manner of things, is all preparatory work for the transformation, the regeneration, the rebirth perhaps ultimately of the Demiurge himself. When the Demiurge is no longer an Ersatz God, but when he is reconciled to his mother Sophia, and when the whole divine household is again one, then I think the redemption of the world has occurred. It's not possible. None other than Carl Jung has indicated in several places, probably the most prominent one that I quoted, I mentioned before, in answer to Job, that a changing of the consciousness of the Demiurge is possible, and that those of us who are involved in transformation of the spirit and so forth can facilitate that. Now, this is, I think this is a monumental prediction, and it is connected with others, and certainly there is no time to go into that now. But let us say, after all, the false god, the Demiurge himself, came forth from Sophia. So this entity has Sophia's spirit in it. He went, he didn't manage to have the same consciousness, for which reason he created the imperfection. But he himself may be perfected, and when he is perfected, then maybe this strange, crazy, painful, and as Madame Blavatsky called it, the sorrowful world can change it to something else. So this is an incredible prospect that we can facilitate the salvation of God, the God of this world, known by some as such, who is today, to the extent that we ourselves are made whole that we ourselves individuate, as you would call it, that we ourselves move into the realm of purity and goodness, then the entire picture and the picture of including the so-called God of this world can change and can change into something good. So the salvation of the world, the bringing of the ambivalent and difficult world into goodness is a possibility. And we can take a hold in that possibility. Why? Because we, within ourselves, we in turn were so brought into existence that we have that potential in us, and we can envision, we can converse with, and we can ultimately unite with that ineffable greatness that is within us. And when we do that, then all the world, including its godly, will be redeemed, will be transformed, and will be glorified. So you see, in a certain sense, Angelo Silesius says that I so often quote, "To Christ 1,000 times in Bethlehem be born, but not in thee, thy soul is all forlorn. The cross at Golgotha standeth up in vain, unless in thee we elect again." Unless this begins to happen in us, we can facilitate it, we can be co-saviors of the world with the other great saviors who have been here and who are here and who are coming. Because we are the ones in whom the God resides, right now maybe crucified, but soon to resurrect and to come into His own. And that is the greatest and the most wonderful promise that I have ever encountered. And if I was able to, at least to bring a little of that feeling along with the evocation of strange entities to you this evening, well then I'm glad that I was able to do that. I hope to see you again, and meanwhile, God bless us all.